Hello Proponomics people, and this morning I'm going to go through today's just released ONS inflation report in some level of detail and talk in some ways about where and how I think inflation is going to move over the rest of this year and the rest of this cycle, because for some months we were hearing that inflation is vanquished. There'll obviously be some who see the move from 3.4% in February to 3.2% in March and say, right, we're still on the way down, all's good. And it's largely beaten. But let's go through the ONS report first, and then I'm going to go into a bit more detail about my own thoughts. So the ONS lead with CPIH. They much prefer CPIH as it captures the housing costs. I mentioned before about CPIH being a little bit synthetic when it comes to owner-occupiers. The idea of sort of charging themselves rent is something that comes into the measure, but no metric is perfect, and they see it as the best they've got. And it was up by 3.8%. in the 12 months to March 24. Most people are concentrating on CPI, which was at 3.2, as I said, instead of 3.4. That's what the Bank of England are targeted on CPI, not CPIH. Monthly movements, CPIH up by 0.6. It was up by 0.7 in March 23. If you remember March 23, that was a month when inflation was still double digits overall. So not moving necessarily dissimilar month to month, although we have to be careful on the month to month, especially in the pandemic figures, because months didn't really do what they thought they would, although January 24 didn't really do what we would have expected it would either. So it just happens with stats sometimes, and consumption patterns, and also the way they're measured, to be honest. CPI was up another 0.6 month on month compared to 0.8 in March 23, so it doesn't look dramatically vanquished at this point with those month on month movements. Downward contributions still coming from food, prices rising by a lot less than a year ago, but largest contributions upwards, motor fuels, prices falling, and they were falling a year ago, but prices are actually moving forward in motor fuels at the moment, month to month. And you'll know why that is. Oil has moved from sort of 70-ish to sort of 90-ish, although we are talking about March's figures, remember. So I think we're about 85 at the end of March, but still oil moving upwards, so that does put that upwards, and you'd expect the same to be true in April, unless anything dramatically changes and there's a sudden surprising peace treaty in the Middle East. So next up, core 4.7, that's CPIH. So 4.7 down from 4.8 the month before, but this is not a vanquished inflation, folks, I'm afraid. Core CPI 4.2, that's down from 4.5. All of these prints, again, were very similar to the US figures the other week. The consensus had done a reasonably good job of predicting where they were going to be, but they've overshot the consensus once again. So not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, I'm sure you'll agree. So in some level of detail then, what do I think about these figures? We know that April's figures will measure the 15% cut in the energy price cap for households, the domestic price cap. So that will be a difference, because plenty of people been on variable rates. More people would have stuck on variable rates for their energy because they weren't sure about when to fix. There was all this, confusion and disinformation. And we're certainly seeing from our portfolio, there's still a number of tenants who are relatively struggling with what to do with their energy these days, and or didn't put their heating on in 2022, found out they survived those winters and have reallocated funds elsewhere, quite frankly, instead of putting it through the heating. So there was an article the other day that was published about heating bills, utility bill, the rising utility bills being like an extra month's rent to tenants. But again, I criticise these things all the time because they're taken out of context. They're not in the context of wage rises. They're not in the context of benefits rises. So out of context, I can write you an article at the moment about anything that's gone up 20+% over the last 4 years and say how terrible it is if I don't talk about how much everything else has gone up. Now, we're supposed to have this month now, the forecasters who were saying we're going to go below 2% in April 24 have gone very quiet this morning. Perhaps they're going to pop out and prove me wrong and talk to me how we're still going to get below 2% next month. So to go from 3.2 to 1.9 or lower would be some move. We've had bigger nominal moves in this downward cycle, and we have got this drop in energy prices, as I say. It would probably have to be supplanted by a drop in the consumption figures as well. And that's what the one person on the Monetary Policy Committee, Dr. Swati Dhingra, has been pushing. The theory that consumption is really struggling and therefore that's why we need to lower the interest rate, because consumption is a big part of the economy. We don't want a recession, etc., etc. We now know, sitting at 0.4 up roughly for the last 2 months. We haven't had March's figures yet, of course, but when we get them, which will be in sort of second week of May, we'll have, it's nearly impossible. March was a 0.4% drop in the economy with all the real-time measures we've got, and also having seen that inflation has held up. When inflation has held up, it normally means people have still been buying things. Now, one of my big arguments is that's going to offset this drop in April is that buying power has significantly increased in April. However, just because the wages go up on the first of the month, if you get paid weekly, obviously you feel that within the first 7 days of the month. But the vast majority of people these days are on monthly salary. A lot of minimum wage workers, that might well not be the case. I don't know what the ratio is between weekly pay and monthly pay for minimum wage earners, but it's going to be a significant difference in the pocket if they were on minimum or on any kind of salary. We've got some businesses that benchmark to minimum, so they're pegged to minimum, so there would be an uplift over and above minimum, for example, to consider. So there's, I think, 2.7 million jobs paid at minimum wage, according to the ONS. And then there would be however many, again, possibly another 2.7 million or more that are anchored to minimum or are forced up by minimum. They might not have had to go up by the 9.8, which was the nominal rise in the wage, but the nominal rise in the cost base was 11.6. So I think you've seen in plenty of businesses this month, certainly saw it anecdotally again last night, and I know in some of the stuff that we run, we've had to put prices up again in April 24, and that has not been a 2% price rise or even a 5 or 6% price rise. We've had to go further because we are trying to offset the increase in those costs. And even the local authority funded businesses that we're involved in have had to concede to a rise of something between 7 and 8%. It's a bit disgrace, to be honest with you, because that's not encapsulating how much costs have gone up. But every year the local authorities just continue with expecting the private sector to subsidise anybody funded by the LA. It realistically means withdrawal of services, or you have to cut something else in order to fit their budgets. But they don't really care about that. They just give you that problem and they say, get on with it. I mean, when your workers are on minimum wage in the care sector, for example, not that all of our care workers are by any stretch of the imagination, but some of them are. And when they are on minimum wage and it's gone up 11.5%, 7%, and that's the majority of the cost base for the business, it's fairly self-evident that it's not enough, probably. Although, of course, inflation is a bit more manageable, but we're also dealing with things from a couple of years ago, where if you look at the April 22 rises, they were very, very small, and we were facing pretty significant inflation at the time because they were coming from September 21. So it's how the cookie crumbles. But, as I've said already, pressure on oil prices upwards, that has those first order effects at the petrol pumps, and then it has those second order effects as well, food on the shelves and all the rest of it. Food inflation has come right down. It doesn't mean that food prices are falling. We did have a couple of months last year where things had gone too far, where food prices were genuinely falling month to month. They're still increasing year to year, and they're still increasing month to month in general. They're making a contribution. The point of the ONS is they're making a smaller contribution to the energy, to the inflation figures than they were. So that's what's worth bearing in mind. I mean, CPIH 0.7 month on month, as I said, CPI 0.6 month on month. It's not looking distinctly different from when we had big inflation last year. I mean, notable differences: clothing a bit more under control, furniture and household goods a bit more under control than March 22. I mean, month on month, restaurants and hotels 1.1% up. And there you go. Not really a surprise, because apart from anything else, significant number of minimum wage workers. Communication 1.7% up month on month. Can't really tell you why that is. Recreation and culture, again, likely to be populated by a lot of minimum wage workers, 0.9% up month on month. So businesses aren't stupid, and that's what they're seeing. Alcohol and tobacco, 0.9% up month on month. Of course, that's pretty topical at the moment with the smoking bill going through Parliament and getting through its first stage last night. But all goods, 0.6 up. All services, 0.6 up. The flash PMIs and the PMIs for March, as they stabilised, were all pretty good, with manufacturing and construction just over 50 for the first time in a long time, and services just around the sort of 52, 53-ish mark, which took the composite to 52.8. So still a healthy enough reading. It's unlikely that meant nothing for March. We'll have to again look at consumption, and I've said before, Easter, the balance of Easter, it brings forward some consumption, but also it introduces a bank holiday, so that might not look great compared to the March dropping off from the year before. We'll just have to see how that is. But we're looking at growth of 0.4 to 0.5, and we're looking at more inflation, folks, I'm afraid.